You've seen the pictures, right? These gleaming architectural models, these huge government announcements, all promising a faster, brighter future. They're called mega projects, symbols of progress built to last for generations. But what happens when they don't? What happens when they become monuments to failure? Well, today we're going to dig into the anatomy of these billion-dollar disasters. And to really get a feel for the scale, let's just start with the price tags.
Okay, first up, $1.1 billion. That's what it cost to build the Ciudad Real Central Airport in Spain. It was supposed to be this bustling international hub, but instead it got a much spookier nickname, the Ghost Airport, a place where the only sound in the empty terminals was, well, silence.
Next, let's jump to $2.3 billion. That's the price for the Bataan nuclear power plant in the Philippines. Now picture this, a totally finished, state-of-the-art facility all ready to power a country, and it was never, ever switched on. Not one single watt of electricity. Ever.
And for the grand finale, a staggering $11 billion. And get this, that was just the estimate when they finally decided to pull the plug. This was for America's Superconducting Super Collider, a particle accelerator that was going to be 3 times bigger than CERN. And what's left of that dream? Just miles of dark, empty, flooded tunnel underneath Texas. So what do you get when you put a ghost airport in Spain, a mothballed nuclear plant in the Philippines, and a giant empty hole in Texas in the same room? What do they all have in common besides, the absolutely insane price tags?
The short answer is they were all spectacular failures. But here's the really important part. These things weren't just bad luck. It wasn't random. These disasters, they follow a script. There are patterns here, and today we're going to break them down.
All right, so the first recipe for disaster is actually pretty simple. You start with a fundamentally flawed blueprint. We're talking about projects that were basically doomed from day one because the big idea, the core vision, was just completely disconnected from how the world actually works. A perfect case study is Montreal's Mirabel Airport. I mean, look at this. On paper, the promise was unbelievable. It was going to be the world's largest airport, a gateway for 60 million passengers a year with a slick, high-speed train zipping you right downtown. But the reality? It wasn't even close. The whole thing was demolished in 2014. It never saw more than 3 million passengers in its best year. And that high-speed train? Yeah, that never happened.
So why did it fail so epically? Well, the plan just completely ignored basic common sense. The airport was built almost 40 kilometers outside the city with no easy way to get there. But even worse was the split flight system. You'd land on an international flight at Mirabel, but then, to catch a connecting flight to somewhere else in Canada, you had to get on a bus for an hour to go to the other airport across town. I mean, who would want to do that? Unsurprisingly, airlines and passengers just hated it. But, sometimes a flawed plan isn't just an accident. It can be a little more cynical. Take Spain's Ghost Airport. As this quote suggests, the success of the airport itself might have been totally irrelevant to the people building it. Why? Well, because they were making a fortune from the billion-dollar construction contracts, which were often awarded to companies they themselves owned. So the dream fails, but the builders, they still walk away rich. Okay, so some projects are just bad ideas from the start, but not all of them. Our second pattern is about projects that were actually pretty viable, maybe even brilliant, but they became victims of shifting winds. They were just swept away by huge forces way outside of their control. I mean, there's no better example of this than the Bataan nuclear power plant. It actually started as a pretty smart idea, a response to the oil crisis in the 70s. But then, as you can see here, it was just hit by a perfect storm. First, right as it's almost done, the 3 Mile Island accident happens in the US, and suddenly everyone is terrified of nuclear power. Then the political regime that ordered the plant gets overthrown in a revolution. And the final nail in the coffin? Just 2 months later, Chernobyl. The political will just evaporated, basically overnight, and a completed $2 billion power plant was just mothballed forever. We see pretty much the same kind of story with the Superconducting Super Collider. The promise was absolutely immense, right? To cement America's leadership in physics, to unlock the deepest secrets of the universe. But the political and economic reality was just brutal. The original cost estimate more than tripled, the foreign funding they were promised never showed up, so when a recession hit in the early 90s, Congress took one look at this massive price tag for what to them was just abstract science, and they just pulled the plug. And maybe the most jaw-dropping example of all is the Soviet Buran shuttle.
Technologically, this thing was an absolute marvel. In a lot of ways, it was more advanced than NASA's shuttle. It even completed a perfect, fully automated, uncrewed flight. An incredible achievement. But just 3 years later, in 1991, its entire reason for existing, the Soviet Union, just ceased to exist. In an instant, the funding, the political will, the entire system that supported it was just gone.
So what happens to these places? What's the afterlife for a broken billion-dollar dream? Well, the legacy is usually this weird mix of slow decay and some really bizarre second acts.
Yeah, their afterlives are all over the map. Spain's Ghost Airport actually found a new gig during the pandemic as a giant parking lot for all the grounded airplanes. The land where Maribel used to be, it's now an industrial park. The Bataan plant, it just sits there in limbo, costing millions of dollars every single year just to maintain it. And the Super Collider, it's just slowly being swallowed by nature. 14 miles of abandoned tunnels, flooding with water, right under the Texas prairie.
So what's the takeaway here? When you really boil it all down, the recipes for these billion-dollar disasters come down to two main ingredients. Either you start with a vision that's just fundamentally broken and out of touch with reality, or you create something genuinely great that just gets swept away by the unstoppable tides of history.
And that leaves us with one last, really big question. Look, ambition is what drives us forward. We have to dream big if we want to solve big problems. But as we design the next generation of mega projects, how do we make sure we're not just creating the expensive, empty ruins of tomorrow?